Those dual rear tires, I don't believe, are factory equipment. Okay. Well, we have a 1950 Ford Custom Deluxe convertible in Miami cream. It's brought to us by Daryl Harding of right here in Dearborn. The car is equipped with a number of factory approved accessories, including twin spotlights, outside rear view mirror, the door guards that keep fingernails from scratching the door if somebody reaches in to pull the door open. It's got stone guards to the rear of the front wheel opening, and the wheel covers that Ford announced in mid-year 53 that cover, they have a hole in the center so the hubcap shines through, and so they don't have to re-stamp the center. Also has rear fender skirts with marked by 3 ribs, and on this side you can see there's also a door edge guard on the fuel filler door. Do you have anything more to add, Roger?
Yeah, the 50 Ford was essentially a carryover of the all-new 49 model. 1949 Ford came out in June of 1948, so it had kind of an extended model year. So they had quite a bit of time to come up with revisions to the 1950 design. They claimed this was the 50 ways new, 50 ways finer Ford for 1950. And there were a lot of revisions, and one of the most important ones is that they hid the fuel filler under a door in the quarter panel. The exposed fuel filler cap on the 49 Ford was the only thing that interrupted the smooth body sides. So I think everybody was happy to see that they hid the fuel filler behind the door. 1950 was also the year that, or a year that they offered both 6 and V8. But if you got a convertible, generally speaking, you would be getting the V8 car.
I believe the station wagon was also V8 only at that time. Very nice car, and thanks for bringing
Thanks very
it
much.
around. He's got dual exhausts with sporty mufflers too, which wasn't that uncommon for Ford convertibles at the time.
Next, we have a 1950 Willis Jeepster, brought in by Jim and Dee King of Farmington, Michigan. 1950, well, first of all, backing up a little bit, in the post-war years, Willis decided to market their Jeep vehicle that they came out with for World War II as a civilian vehicle for use in general purposes. In fact, it was the GP Jeep. And the Jeepster was an attempt, styled by Brooks Stevens, to bring the Jeep into a more sophisticated marketplace. This Jeepster, being in 1950, exhibits the new grille that Jeep came out with, which is V'd instead of flat. And so it gave the Jeep vehicle a little bit different look. And it's also a very sporty vehicle, being two-tone paint, and it had a conventional convertible top.
The engine, it was an inline 6 of 148 cubic inches, 72 horsepower, had a single Carter carburetor. The wheelbase of the vehicle was 104 inches, overall length 176, and the original tire size was 590/14. An interesting thing to those of you who follow baseball, it shouldn't surprise you that the Cleveland Indians of that era had a Jeepster to haul the pitchers out from the bullpen. And so on the radio, when they'd announce a change of a pitcher, they'd say, "The little yellow Jeepster is headed to the bullpen now, and so-and-so's going to be in to relieve somebody else." So,
and this model Jeepster was only built for 3 years, from 1948 to 1950. So to see one today is kind of a rare sight. And the Jeepster name did resurface later on in the 1960s. Thanks very much for bringing it. So it looks like we're going to mix a truck in here.
Yeah, we got it must be a 50 Chevy. 49s look the same from the outside. So anyway, this is a 3100 series Chevrolet pickup truck from 1950. And it's brought to us by somebody from Plymouth, Michigan.
Georgette Doherty.
Okay. And there's some embellishments on it. The cab quarter windows were part of the Deluxe cab package, and I think the upholstery on the inside was upgraded with that package, and the chrome grille was also a salient feature of it. There's some extra chrome trim added to the wheels, and the stake bed, the wooden stake bed, the box extension, the wooden extensions were probably made special for the truck by somebody. Now, the cab corner windows were a novelty that appeared with the Advanced Design Chevrolet and also the GMC, which used the same cab, and then Dodge copied it when their 48 model came out. These Chevys came out as 47 models with a spring of the year arrival.
This truck has an overhead valve 6, approximately 92 horsepower, and Chevrolet was alone in the field of Dodge, Ford, and Chevrolet pickups that offered an overhead valve engine. The overhead valve design would be prevalent throughout the 1950s as manufacturers turned to that design, but Chevrolet had this since 1929. So it's a real player in modern design, or advanced design as they called it.
Well, Chevrolet had overhead valves going back to the 4-cylinder era as well, but
Well,
that's
for 6 cylinders we're
yeah,
talking
yeah,
here.
that's beyond the scope of what we're supposed to talk about. So
Thanks very much.
Ooh.
So we go back to cars.
Well, we have a 1950 Buick arriving.
Yes, this is a longtime Motor Muster participant, brought in by Mike and Jeanette Forster of Southfield, Michigan. A 1950 Buick Super, and it's a Riviera, which means that there's no center B pillar. Buick kind of pioneered this design along with other GM makes in 1949, and it gave a really convertible flavor to their two-door models. And legend has it that Ed Ragsdale, who was the general manager of Buick, used to get Buicks to drive, and his wife always ordered a convertible, but she never put the top down. And they asked her about that, and she said, well, I just like the lines of a convertible because it looks so open. So they developed the two-door hardtop body style, which Buick called its Riviera, and it became a very popular choice.
In fact, there were 114,000, nearly 115,000 of this particular model built in 1950. The engine was upgraded to a higher displacement in 1950 from 248 to 263 cubic inches, and it was rated at 124 horsepower with a standard transmission and 128 with the higher compression engine that was linked with the Dynaflow automatic transmission. And you can see the words Dynaflow on this car, which tells you, like nearly all 50 Buick Supers, it had Dynaflow transmission.
And another feature of Buick started in 1949 was the Ventaport. You'll notice those 3 oval openings on the side of the hood. And Mike has pointed out in his write-up that this is the only year that Buick had the Ventaports in its hood. All other years had them in the fenders. And I never really thought of that before, but that's true. So this is kind of a unique touch to a 50 model Buick.
And in some years they were actually fake because they apparently had whatever cooling issues they were worried about corrected, but they kept them as a sort of a design tradition.
and for whatever reason, they gained the name of portholes, and Buick advertised them as being a smart nautical note added to the car. The interesting part about a 50 Buick also is it's the only Buick that had a grille that was essentially made up of bumper guards. And there's different sized bumper guards. Each one is differently sized. So it's a real job putting these things together in order because there are different sizes and different angles. So it's quite a thing to see.
Apparently, they were prone to loosening and rattling. A friend of mine had an older brother that had one of those Buicks at the time, and he was complaining about that. And he maybe had to regularly tighten them. I'm not sure. But
Yeah.
thanks. Oops.
Well, there's one more thing. The other interesting thing about a 50 Buick is this is the second time in as many years that Buick came out with an all-new car. The 49 was an all-new design, and it was really a beautiful car, but they came back in 1950, and they came out with another new design. So they really were fashion conscious in that era. And Buick's shared bodies with Oldsmobile and Cadillac, so the whole line went to this similar design in 1950. Thanks very much.
This is one of our regular.
You don't have to hold up the card. This is
We
Craig.
know you.
Craig Elam from Centerline, Michigan, is bringing his Volkswagen in for many years to Motor Muster. And we have to again thank him for sharing it with us because it's an early model Volkswagen. Volkswagen started importing cars into the U.S. in 1949, and Craig's model is a 1951. And when they started importing Volkswagens in 1949, they imported two. So they started right from the bottom. But the way you can tell easily an older model Volkswagen is the small rear window. And in fact, Craig's Volkswagen has the divided rear window. So that signifies it as an early model.
The other thing it has is the semaphore type direction signals. Can you flip them out for the public? Oh, you have to do it from outside, huh?
Yeah,
oh, okay.
They just needed a little help.
Little help. Okay.
And I think Craig has owned this car since 1974 or something like that. So he's actually had this car for a good long time. And he's probably been enjoying it ever since. And the other interesting thing about Volkswagen is it had a torsion bar suspension. And so that was a different aspect of design. And of course, the air-cooled engine became what it was known for. Thanks very much.
So we have a pair of 51 Studebakers.
Okay.
And they're
So-
both two-door sedans.
And where's the Holtz car? There we go. Okay, the blue-gray Studebaker is brought in by David and Ann Holtz of Brighton, Michigan. And the black Studebaker is brought in by Jerry Doherty of Plymouth, Michigan. These both have been pretty long time participants of Motor Muster, and they signify the bullet nose Studebaker of the early 1950s. Studebaker came out with their all-new car in 1947, first by far with an all-new car. And they subsequently revised it to keep up with styling trends. And this was a Raymond Loewy design. Studebaker would contract him to come up with their basic designs, and then they would revise them from year to year. Well, in 1950 and 51, they came up with this interesting front design, which made the front look like a propeller. And it really gave Studebaker a unique look.
The blue car is said to have the automatic hill holder. I can't recall whether that was a standard feature in all Studebakers or an option, but the idea was that you're shaking your head. It's an option? Yeah, and the idea was that when you were on a grade, the brakes, there would be a valve that would lock the hydraulic fluid so that your brakes would stay on after you had stopped on the hill. The six-cylinder engine was 170 cubic inch, which was a bit smaller than Plymouth or Chevy or Ford had. And production broke out nearly 7,800 in South Bend, Indiana, 813 in Los Angeles, 262 in Canada, and 41 in export.
Yeah, the Champion was known as an economical car as well. And Studebaker would carry this design through the next model year through 1952, and in which case it would be coming out with a new car in 1953. Another neat option that Studebaker had was called the climatizer, and that was their heating system that was an under-seat mounted unit. So that was a different aspect of their design as well. But there's a lot of people that bought these, Jim, and I think especially the 50 models.
Yes, well, the 51s were pretty good too. Now, the Korean War, in a sense, helped boost car sales in 1951 because people were afraid that automobile rationing would start like it did in 1942, which it didn't happen. But 51 was such a good year for the industry in the U.S. It was second only to 1950 in terms of volume. And of course, Studebaker was a substantial contributor to that.
And the other interesting part is that these cars are as old as me because we were made in the same year. Thanks very much for bringing them by.
But I was enough older that I was able to go pick up literature on these cars at the Studebaker dealership in Ohio back at the time. Thank you very much. Well, I like the I Like Ike license plate on the front of this 1951 Ford Custom Deluxe two-door, brought to us by John Forster of Royal Oak. The color is, I should know it's a green, but there was I think that was maybe Sea Island green. No, he doesn't know either. I know my Uncle Jeff had one like that, but because of the Korean War, he couldn't get white sidewall tires for his. This was the first year that Ford offered an automatic transmission. They called it Ford-O-Matic. It was not that common, but I presume this car does not have it. Is that right? Manual? Overdrive? Manual overdrive.
And overdrive was an option.
It was an option, but a lot of people bought those cars with overdrive. One of the other things that stands out, makes this car different from the 49s and 50s that used the same body shell, is the chrome on the what they called the wind splits, where the quarter panel flared out to encompass the taillight housing. The taillights were also larger, and for the first time, these Fords had a key release trunk lid. You didn't have to lift the handle anymore.
The trunk lid also did not have exposed hinges like the 49 and 50 models. And regarding the taillights too, this is the first year that Ford used plastic for the taillight lenses. So that was kind of a big development. Ford had 3-year model cycles during this time. 51 is the last year of the cycle. But they put a lot of revisions in this car to make it look like a newer car. For example, you have the dual spinner grille. They chromed the rings that circle the headlights. They changed the hood ornament. And pretty big change was the instrument panel and steering wheel inside. So when you sat in this Ford, it really seemed like it was a newer car. And Jim mentioned, I think, the F wheel caps, which was only used this year. Usually you had the Ford nomenclature or a crest on it. So it kind of made this 51 a unique model. But this one looks great, and I think the Tudor was probably the biggest seller.
Well, it was a close, if it wasn't, it was a close second. At that time, families were buying two-doors because of safety of kids in the back seat. They didn't have the interlocks that they have today to keep the rear doors from opening. And so that was a factor. We've already talked about the key release deck lid, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for bringing it around, and it reminds me of my youth when I see these cars.
Thank you.
There we go, 173. This is a 1952 Mgtd Mark II brought to us by John and Mary Gervasi of Trenton, Michigan. It is a roadster type, which is what MG also made sedans, but I don't think they ever imported enough of them to the United States to make any difference. And according to what is written here, there are only 1,022 of these things built, or at least imported to the United States, but I would be willing to bet that a large percentage of them still are around because of their unique desirability. The base price was $2,145. The engine was a four-cylinder overhead valve, 145 cubic inches, and developed 54 horsepower. The tires are 556/15 perforated wheels, 4-speed transmission. This particular car's options include a luggage rack, the chrome badge bar, and spotlight, radio which fits in the glove box, and a twin spare tire carrier, even though he's only got one on board at the time.
The Mgtd was a successor to the TC, which you may have seen parade earlier. The earlier MGs had wire wheels and they had bigger tire sizes. When you got to the TD, it looked more lower to the ground because it had smaller disc wheels. The Mark II option gives you a higher compression ratio and I believe a higher axle ratio as well. And it was intended for the American market because in Britain, where these cars were manufactured, the fuel higher octane fuel wasn't available like it was in the US. So a lot of the MGs were exported to begin with, but the Mark II is generally intended for the American market. It would be succeeded by the TF, which was in 1954, and then the all-new MGA in 1955. Early MGs, when they were imported in the U.S., were right-hand drive. You can see this as a conventional American-type left-hand drive, so the steering wheel's on what we would call the correct side. But it's still a very sleek car, and it looks a lot lower than the previous model, but it's still very sporty. This is the car that servicemen that were serving in Europe, they would see these and they would import them into the U.S. when it was a lot easier to do something like that. And so these became a lot of fun to drive in the U.S., and you didn't see too many of them. But that kind of gave the inspiration to come out with cars like the Chevrolet Corvette, even the Crosley Hotshot, and later on the personal Ford Thunderbird. Thanks very much.
Okay, we have another, geez, we're seeing all these cars like my Uncle Jeff used to have. This is the second one now. It's a 52 Ford Custom Line Tudor sedan brought to us by Mark and Carol Garrett of Garden City. And of course, the color is obviously black. Its base price was $1,640. They produced 175,762 of them. It's powered by the 239 cubic inch V8 engine, which was rated at 110 horsepower that year. It has a 7.2 to 1 compression ratio, a 2-barrel carburetor. Wheelbase is 115 inches, which is one more than the year before. Overall length is 197.8 inches. And it says here the base tire size was 600 by 16, but those look like 15-inch wheels to me. So somebody paid a little extra to get the 15-inch wheels, and the tires might even be 710s, which would be a size up maybe than what was absolutely necessary.
So the write-up says that this is a 27,000 mile car. 27,000 miles on this 52 Ford. I don't know how people could keep from driving it because it looks like a great road car. Ford Motor Company revised, or actually redid, all three of their vehicle lines, Ford, Mercury, and Lincoln, in 1952. And they were one of the only manufacturers, if not the only manufacturer, that did that. Chevrolet and Plymouth, who competed directly with Ford, had carryover cars for 1952. So Ford kind of had a leg up in styling because they looked really modern. This is the first year that Ford introduced their jet tube taillights, and those round taillights became kind of a Ford trademark over the years. The custom line was the mid-level series. Now this one looks pretty nice because it's got white wall tires and trim rings on the wheels, and it looks great. But there was a Crestline that was above it, and there was also a main line that was the base series below it. But I think the custom line is the one that most people bought, and you saw a lot of these cars when they were new.
Well, the Crestline was restricted to the Victoria two-door hardtop, the convertible, and the wood-bodied station wagon. So if you wanted a sedan, you had to get a custom line at that time. Anyway, a very nice car, and thanks for bringing it again.
Thank you.
It's got backup lights too.
Okay, next up we have a 1952 Studebaker Champion brought in by Mike Pulaski of Livonia, Michigan. Mike's been a longtime participant. Motor Muster brought his Studebaker many years, and I believe this car has the original paint, if I'm not mistaken, because it's wearing a little bit thin on the front fenders. Studebaker intended to bring out its all-new car in 1952, and it wasn't quite ready for production. So they had to extend the 51 body style one more year. So what they did is they eliminated the bullet nose that you saw earlier and kind of revised the front end to look more conventional. The rest of the car is pretty much carryover, but they did make those changes in the front. They changed the taillights, and they continue with the basic style. But this is a really nice original example Studebaker from that time.
The engine is 169 cubic inch, 85 horsepower, which lent itself to Studebaker's reputation of high gas mileage, and when coupled with overdrive, it was even better. It could be purchased with an automatic transmission, which was called automatic drive, but I don't think very many were actually built. There were that many Champions built that way. That was primarily for the 8-cylinder Commander and Land Cruiser, which had V8 engines.
Yeah, Studebaker introduced their V8 engine in, the year before, but Champions were noted for their 6-cylinder engine. And also in 1952, Studebaker celebrated its centennial, its 100th anniversary. In 1952, I think Cadillac was celebrating its 50th anniversary. So Studebaker was a long-time manufacturer, starting with wagons in the 1800s. So that was quite a milestone that they celebrated that year.
They advertised that year 100 years on the road, which of course nobody else could match.
And in
So-
fact, their station wagon models later in the decade, they named Conestoga wagons, kind of a nod to their past. Thanks very much.
Well, we got something unusual today.
Aw,
Oh, you've got the write-up?
that I do. This is a man without a car. We were given this at last minute, and I got to say that this is something very unique. This is a Rio mower, REO. That stands for Ransom Eli Olds. That's a remnant of the man's company that invented the Oldsmobile. In the 1950s, the move to suburbia kind of prompted better ways to take care of your yard. When you lived in the city, you had a postage stamp-sized lawn, so you could easily use a hand mower that's not powered. But moving to the suburbs gave you bigger lawns, and there was a need for a power lawnmower. The first mowers were reel type, so in other words, they were basically hand mowers with motors attached. But then in the early 50s, they started to come out with something called a rotary mower, which most of us are familiar with today. This is an early model of a rotary mower, and what Rio did is they adapted their horizontal crankshaft engine to a rotary chassis. So they used a gearbox that you can see behind the engine to actually turn the blade that's under the mower. This is in contrast to a reel mower, which has the engine just powering the blade horizontally. Of course, after this, they developed vertical crankshaft engines to be able to turn your rotary blade like you do today. This is a 1953 model, and it's called the Flying Cloud.
Which was the name of a Rio car back in the 20s.
And this is an original condition mower, which even in 1953 had typical car colors on it. So the green turquoise was something you'd see probably on the road as well as in your yard. But Rio was actually a very popular brand of lawnmower, but they're mostly known for the reel mowers versus the rotary mowers. They had a few problems with this particular design in that the gearbox would have a washer on it that would kind of come apart with a lot of use. So unfortunately, they got kind of a bad rap for this. But Rio was also a producer of one of the early electric lawnmowers. And of course, they also had the reel mowers all along, so people still could buy those. So this is really a real relic for the past, and it's kind of neat to see something that's that good in original condition.
And the Rio mowers used the same color scheme too. So when you
They
saw
did.
a Rio
Yes, they did.
when you saw a Rio mower, you knew you were seeing a Rio. Oh, are we going to have a cutting demonstration here?
Yep. The only exhibition of cutting concrete you'll ever see. But you know, that's typical that you would dress up to cut the grass in the 1950s. No shorts, no jeans. You'd have to have a hat and a pipe, and you'd also have to have khaki pants. So yeah, that's typical too. You always had to dress up to go out.
Well, here we have a Buick Roadmaster from D. Davy of Plymouth, Michigan. This is was the top of the line in the Buick family, except of course for the convertible and the wood wagon. But the 6 windows sedan was mainly the one people who bought Buick Roadmasters bought. 1953 also was the first Buick with a V8 engine. Overhead valve V8, which was unique to Buick in that it had vertical valves, and they like to brag about them. It displaced 322 cubic inches and developed 188 horsepower, which was substantial at that time. According to what's reported here, its base price was $4,031, which wasn't chicken feed back then, and production reached over 50,523. The wheelbase was 121 and a half inches. Buick was able to reduce that number by 4 inches from the previous year because of the compactness of the V8 engine versus the straight 8. Overall length of 207.6 was again a substantial reduction due to the fact that the long straight 8 engine was no longer being used. Now, they have listed here that it has a manual transmission, but it's my understanding the Buick Roadmasters were all Dynaflows. And hers is Dynaflow, so she might not be confirming what I'm saying, but she's confirming that she has Dynaflow. Power steering and power brakes were standard on this series, and so were the full wheel covers, although this one has simulated wire wheel covers, which were a thing in the 1953-54 era. The European sports cars sort of had their impact on the American market, and wire wheels made a brief return, whether in real form or simulated, as shown here.
Yeah, you could see how American manufacturers were adapting to the V8, how they like to advertise it. Look at those huge V's on the wheel covers. That was really a significant thing. And most years during the 1950s, the top-of-the-line Buicks would have 4 Ventaports on the fender, as this Roadmaster shows. Lesser Buicks would have 3. So you could tell at a glance that you're looking at the top-of-the-line Buick. Another thing I noticed about this 1953 model is that it has easy eye glass. So it has tinted glass, which is very commonplace in standard equipment today. But back then, it was kind of unusual to see that nice soft tint on the glass as the vehicle moved by. Another unique Buick feature is the hood or the roof-mounted antenna. You can see that it's fully extended. So they took the antenna off of the fender and they would put it on the roof. And as Dee has demonstrated, you could turn it down if you go through a car wash, and you could retract it so that it was not sticking up. Buick, I believe, had a V in that bomb sight hood ornament,
yes,
which was kind of a Buick thing. And they also were coming out with pretty large-sized bumper guards as well. This is a 50th anniversary year for Buick, and I believe something is noted on the front bumper about 50 years. And that was one thing about Buick, is on some model years, they used to actually put the model year of the car on the front grille. So this is kind of a unique Buick. Very nice condition, nice subdued color. And Diaz looks like she's dressed in the period outfit, especially the gloves, the June Cleaver gloves.
The other thing you might note too, when we were talking about the tinted windshield, that was easy eyeglass made by Libby Owens Ford Glass, and it has a darker band at the top where you're more apt to get heavier concentration of sun than you would further down. So that's one of those subtle features that you didn't see on every car with tinted windows.
And as you walk around and look at the cars in this year's Motor Muster, you should especially look at the trim details. You'll notice that that small area between the front and the rear door has separate stainless pieces to continue that molding without interruption. That's something that manufacturers did back then, that attention to detail. The other thing about the trim work on this Buick is it exhibits the Buick sweep spear, and it kind of is that molding that goes down just before the rear wheel opening. That kind of became a Buick hallmark, and it was especially notable on Buicks that were 1954 and later.
Thank you very much.
It's the silent V8.
Yep. Oh, the absence of silence, huh?
We don't need a sheet for this one. This is Lee Jacobson from Dearborn, Michigan, bringing his 1953 Jaguar XK 120. When you saw the MGs before, this is what an MG owner might aspire to. This is what I have described as the classic GT, Grand Touring car.
Yep.
This is a 6-cylinder car, and it's the Jaguar XK 120 first came out in 1949, and it became pretty popular with celebrities because it was not an inexpensive car. In 1949 through 1953, when Lee's car was made, these cars would go for like $4,000, and that's like the equivalent of 2.5 Fords. So it was a pretty expensive touring car, and it had some unique engineering, Jim.
Yes, it did. It had torsion bar front suspension, if I remember correctly. And
There you go.
torsion bar front suspension, right? Yeah. And I guess that was the primary thing that I can think of.
Overhead cam
Overhead
engine,
cam
yes, that
engine,
was
yeah.
big. And I think Lee's car has special equipment. And
Yeah.
I never knew for sure, but were the wire wheels part of that? Okay,
Okay.
got it.
And then they left the fender skirts off.
And they had a higher compression ratio, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Yes. So this was a little bit of a special Jaguar, and it had a little bit higher performance than the regular Jaguar. 1 out of every 10, Lee
okay.
says, were equipped this way. And it has a great exhaust note, and you'll be able to tell that when he pulls away. But this is a great-looking Jaguar from that era. And by the way, the XK 120, that 120 means something. It means 120 miles per hour.
But actually, they set a record on a highway in Belgium of 132.6, which was a lot back then. Only 115, huh? With or without a tailwind.
Yeah, that's still pretty respectable, I would say.
But to those of us who like the sound of a V8 engine, there was 1.6 that would curl our blood, and it was a Jaguar. Let's hear from it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Lee. He actually took over. He took off a little more briskly than usual.
Well, we encouraged it, didn't we?
Yes. You did. All right, next we have a 1953 Willis station wagon brought in by the Roscoe family of Temperance, Michigan. As we said before, Willis kind of made an attempt to civilize the wartime Jeep. And this is one of the models they brought out, I believe, in 1946. And what it is an all-steel wagon. This was very unique at the time because usually station wagons were made of wood. And this was an all-steel, which was a more durable kind of design. They still left impressions in the body panels that kind of made it seem like there would be wood inserts in the side. Willis made the station wagon, I think, through 1961, so they had a real long span, and this was one of their more popular models. Willis was also famous for their four-wheel drive. You can see four-wheel drive is shown on the hood, and they would make a big thing about this in their advertising, and they would promote it on the nomenclature on their vehicles. And these vehicles were used for the road, or they could be used on the farm or in forestry. They were extremely versatile.
The interesting thing about the Willis Willys thing is people from Toledo, where they build the things, call them Willys, and a lot of us that grew up in Ohio called them Willys. But according to legend, Mr. Willys or Willis himself said, I don't care how they pronounce my name, just buy my cars. And he made his money really on the Overland, which was a sort of an upscale jump from a Ford Model T. I think that's really what made his money. And then he also used the British Knight engine during the teens, 20s, but not quite into the 30s, that built the reputation of the company. But of course, the Jeep continues to carry it forward. And one of the changes I believe they made in 52 was to go to dual taillights and embed them in the rear pillars as opposed to a license plate bracket with a single taillight as the original Jeep station wagons had. So thank you again for bringing it around.
Okay, next up we have a 1953 Ford Crestline brought in by Gil and Cindy Carlson from Jackson, Michigan. This is the Victoria body style that was introduced in 1951 as a mid-year model. And this is a pillarless design similar to the Buick that you saw earlier. We call them hardtops generically, and the reason that we do is because they were based on convertible bodies, so they were really hardtop convertibles, and they were the rage during the 1950s. Everybody had to bring out one just to be competitive. The Ford Victoria really looked sleek, and this particular one has the Coronado deck, which is a spare tire impression on the rear deck that doesn't really contain a tire. And it kind of gave that Continental flavor and was an unusual accessory that you didn't see too often.
The wire wheels that you see were not a Ford option at the time, but the aftermarket people went into wire wheels in a big way because it was very European and sports car-y. And then with the arrival of the tubeless tires, there were seal problems that sort of said, we better go to a rim that doesn't have holes in it for spokes. The spinners on the wheel covers were also typical of that era. And what's also unusual about this car is the chrome headlamp bezels. Ford was starting in 52, started painting its headlamp bezels to make the headlamps look like they were embedded in the fenders, but this gentleman is not the only man in the world to have gone the chrome approach. And Roger's already talked about the Coronado deck, so we'll thank
this
you.
was, it should probably be noted that this was the last year in the U.S. for the flathead V8 or the
That's
L-head
true.
design V8 that was originally brought out in 1932.
Yeah.
The next year up, 1954, they would go to a modern overhead valve design. So this was kind of the end of the era for the Ford V8 as they knew it in 1953. And this also has tinted glass. I'm not sure that 53s offered tinted glass.
Yes, they did.
They did.
Was
So
in
they
Mid 52.
okay. Ford called their tinted glass iRest as opposed to Easy Eye that GM used. So everybody had their promotional names for every part of the equipment that they offered.
Thank you for bringing it along.
Thank you.
Sporty exhaust too, huh? Duals. Yep.
Dual exhaust.
We jump a couple of years, don't we?
Okay, next we have a 1955 Olds 98 Starfire brought in by the Roberts family of Highland, Michigan. I think this is the first time this car is appearing at Motor Muster, and it's a great example of mid-1950s charm. You can see how the two-tone paint started to become really in vogue. It's more than just giving the top a different color. you had the mid-body sections two-toned as well. Usually this was separated by stainless moldings, as you see on the Oldsmobile here. And 1955 was the second year of this body shell, which was all new in 1954. Has a very modern appearance, and the 98 series was the top of the Oldsmobile line. For whatever reason, Olds decided to append the Starfire name to its convertible models. So not only did you have a top-line car, but you also had a unique name for the convertible. And Starfire would kind of go in and out during the next maybe 15 years. Sometimes it was used to differentiate a personal type car, but for this particular period, it was used for the convertible. You can see how the belt line or the window line is cut down. So it's got that little crease in the back, and it just gives it just a nice, powerful look, and kind of goes with the side trim really nicely. You can see the rocket taillights as well. Olds was known as the rocket action car because it had the rocket V8, which was introduced in 1949.
Okay, thank you for bringing it along, and it's always nice to see these examples of Oldsmobiles.
And I guess we also should point out that those wheel covers with those flipper hubcaps, those spinners, they were kind of known as either Fiesta spinners or Starfire spinners, and became very popular in the aftermarket.
That's true. Well, we have a 55 Studebaker Commander, and we'll find out who it belongs to here in a minute.
It's brought in by Sean Patton from Sandusky, Ohio. If I've got the right one, which I do. Okay, please excuse the confusion. The Studebaker for 1955 was revised with a chrome overlay on the grille. So this was a further evolution of the all-new Studebaker that came out in 1953. Studebaker almost marketed two different kinds of cars. One body was designated for the four-doors, and one body was designated for the coupes. And they had kind of entirely different looks, although the styling was similar. For the sedan, this is a Commander, I believe. So this has got premium trim, and you can see the unique Studebaker design on the wheel covers with the depressed centers. Jim, I think that wraparound windshield was a mid-year addition.
Yes, it was. The 50s, 54, 5, and up to about 60 was the era of the wraparound windshield. And if you didn't have a wraparound windshield, you didn't make it. So Studebaker sort of had essentially a crash program to get the wraparound in to its sedan models in mid-55. They were early on the market, as I recall, they were early introducing their 55 models in the summer of 54, and then, or early fall, and by the spring of 55, they had the, I think they even called them Ultra Vista or some, they had a promotional name for the wraparound windshield as well. Notice also that this car is equipped with a grille guard and the fog lamps that are mounted in special bumper guards. And the Land Cruiser version was, I believe, upgraded to the President name in 1955, and it was on a stretched wheelbase, had quarter windows in the rear doors.
Now our write-up indicates that this color is called Saginaw Green, and I gotta believe it because it's a really pleasing shade. But I would have expected more like it would be called South Bend Green because that's where Studebakers were manufactured.
Or even Indiana Green, huh?
Yes. Very nice car and an unusual example of a mid-50s Studebaker.
Yeah, any Studebaker after 53 you have to consider rare. So thanks for bringing it around.
Thank you.
It's a V8, all right. Oh, my. Well, we have another 55 Ford Thunderbird. As soon as we find the paperwork here, we'll tell you who it belongs to.
What's your number? 188.
188.
Okay, 188 is brought in by Joe Gabry of Royal Oak, Michigan. Thunderbird was introduced in 1955, so this is the first year of this model. Despite it being a two-seater car, it was not really billed as a sports car. Ford billed this car as a personal car of distinction. It was almost the two-seater luxury car, especially when you compare it to the contemporary Corvette of the period. It used a lot of the Ford styling for 1955, but it had its own shape, and I believe the bodies were built by the Budd Company, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So the tail lamps, for example, are similar to 1955 Fords, and the deeply hooded headlights are kind of uniquely Thunderbird. The neat thing about this car is it was available with two tops. The standard top was a fiberglass hard top, which you lifted off, and then an optional top was a soft top that you could fold behind. You could also get one as an additional option, so you could have both tops. And if you drove it all year long, then you could have the hard top in place in the winter. But it was very unique in that it had luxury touches, and it wasn't all about performance, even though it was well powered with the Ford V8,
Yeah, it had
which is actually the Y8.
Yeah, they called it the Y8 because it had a deep skirted block. And that's why when you look at the V8 emblem on the side and the fenders, you see that red underlay. That shows that the crankcase goes down below the center line of the crankshaft. That was a Ford talking point then. I think he already mentioned it was 292 cubic inches. You could get it with 3 different transmissions, although I think most of them were Ford-O-Matics. That's what I presume yours is. Oh, that was the
that's a nice
ideal
option.
combination.
Yes.
Yeah. And that had a lower compression ratio to prevent knocking on regular gas, I guess. So it was only 193 horsepower instead of 198. Okay, anyway.
Yeah, the other interesting thing about the Thunderbird is they kind of made allowances for the car looking kind of small. And being a two-seater, prospects weren't used to seeing this. So they had a power seat that was standard. And power windows were optional. But the neat thing is they had a telescoping steering wheel, which was very unusual for that time. So you could adjust pretty easily to the Thunderbird. And it was a popular car to have in the showroom so that you'd get people to buy Fairlanes. But boy, this thing really looked great on the road too.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, next up we have a 1955 Buick Special brought in by Dennis and Mary Paradowski of St. Clair Shores, Michigan. You know, by 1955, actually the year before, in 1954, Buick attained number 3 in sales in the U.S. These were extremely popular cars, but the unusual thing is usually the low-price cars were number 3 in sales. So you'd have Chevrolet, Ford, and Plymouth. But not in 1954. Buick became number 3 in sales primarily because of the Special Series. It was an attractively priced car, and Buick was right under Cadillac in the GM hierarchy. So there was a lot of value in a Buick Special. And you can see how racy the Buick looked as one of the few cars in the mid-century array that had full cutout wheel wells in the back. So it looked really sporty, and you can see how that sweep spur evolved to accentuate them. So this car was extremely racy looking, but it was basically a family car too. So it had a wide appeal, and the styling was really top notch.
And it also offered plenty of power. Even the special, with its smaller engine, 264 cubic inches, developed 188 horsepower, which is substantial. Now, this car is said to have a 3-speed manual transmission, which is sort of unusual for Buicks because nearly all of them were Dynaflows. So the 3-speed transmission gave it an extra boost for performance.
Although he has the
driving.
Dynaflow.
Huh?
He has the Dynaflow.
Oh. He has Dynaflow?
Yep.
Okay, so the cheat sheet's not right. Okay. Well, thanks for bringing it around, and it's certainly a fine example of a 55 Buick.
And you'll also notice the Ventaports in the front fender, there's only 3. The Roadmaster this year would have had 4. So again, at a glance, you can tell that this is a lower series special, and by no means is it a lesser series car because it's very good. It's very impressive.
Now, the Century was built on the same wheelbase, but it had 4 ports because it had the bigger, more horsepower. But the Century was the hot rod, and this one was the one with broad appeal.
Also in 1955, Buick introduced a 4-door Riviera, which was a 4-door hardtop body style. And so they're covering all the bases in sporty appearance. And you can easily see why they went to number 3 in sales. And this would be a phenomena that would go out throughout the 1960s. The low-priced cars weren't necessarily the highest sellers. People really recognized value in those days.
Buick and Olds both outsold Plymouth in 54. I'm not sure about 55.
Thanks very much.
Yes. Desoto coming. We have a 1954 DeSoto Fireflight
55.
Coronado. 55. Yeah. And Coronado was a special model that they built in both 1954 and 55. And its most distinguishing feature from the outside is the 3-tone paint scheme, the turquoise with a white top or ivory top and black color accent.
Yes, Fireflight represented the top-of-the-line DeSoto, and DeSoto in the Chrysler hierarchy was under Chrysler and over Dodge. So it had a very impressive look to it, and DeSoto's thing was about style. You can see that all the lines of the body kind of flow together, and when you accentuate it by all the different paintwork and body trim, that it really looks impressive. But look at the door handles. The door handles operate a little bit differently. They're both push button and they're pull handles. So that's a little different approach to opening the door. Now, Chrysler Corporation cars, starting in 1955, did adopt the wraparound windshield, but not that excessively like some other manufacturers. You'll notice that there's still a rearward slant to the vent window. So it kind of made getting in and out of the vehicle a little bit easier. Chrysler Corporation vehicles also this year adopted a shifter that was on the instrument panel instead of the column. So that was a difference, and that predated the push buttons that would come the following year. As Jim pointed out, the Coronado treatment was an option, and but still on the top line Fireflight, it was quite a car.
And DeSoto had its unique displacement engine, which was bigger than Dodge, but not quite the same as a Chrysler.
Chrysler Corporation was kind of touting their styling, which was all new that year, for all vehicle lines as the forward look. So people just waited for the next year to see what they would come up with next. 1956, they started the introduction of fins, which was a big development in body design. So before 1955, Chrysler Corporation was a little bit behind the other manufacturers as far as styling. They looked a little bit upright and they looked a little bit dated. But starting in 1955, they took right over, and they were industry leaders.
By 57, they were really ahead. It was actually amazing how they changed almost overnight.
So thanks very much. Here's another example of a Chrysler product from the mid-50s. This is a 1956 Chrysler Windsor brought in by Adam and Courtney Lumsden of Washington, Michigan. Chrysler was also all new in 1955, and in this 1956 model, you can see how the rear quarter panels are kind of creeping upwards. The forward look is developing fins. Chrysler would be known for this by the end of the decade. But as they're developing, it's rather subtle at first, but it kind of takes over their whole styling thing. As we mentioned, Chrysler products were all new in 1955. So this was a successful revision of the all-new design.
There were also engine improvements for that year. I believe the displacement went up to 354 cubic inches with this car. And I sort of lost my train of thought here. I'm sorry.
Yes, the Chrysler still used the hemispherical engine, and
not the
otherwise known
Windsor.
as the Hemi. This is a Windsor, which is the lower series. New Yorker and New Yorker Deluxe was the top line series. But you can see how the body lines are starting to flow together, and it gives it a really impressive look. One interesting option that was new that year is a highway hi-fi. So they actually had a record player that would play special developed discs in the dash. It kind of hung below the dash, and so you could take your records with you. Later on, of course, we had cassette tape players and then compact disc players, but this is how you took your music with you in the mid-1950s. Anything to add, Jimmy?
No, we're all right.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, here we go. We got a couple of 56 Fords, huh?
That is right.
Yeah, all right. We have a couple of 56 Fords here. The first one is a 56 Crown Victoria, bought by Tim and Vickery Gregory of Belleville, Michigan. And there's a Park Lane Wagon waiting in the wings, which we'll be seeing in a few minutes. The Crown Victoria is, of course, was a variation on the two-door hardtop. It had what looked like a roll bar over the top, but it was
that was not a
styling.
roll bar. That was a tiara.
Yeah.
That was a tiara of chrome.
Anyway, I am sure that car has at least a 292 cubic inch V8 or maybe a 312. He's nodding the 312, which was the biggest engine, 225 horsepower, came only with the Ford-O-Matic transmission. The Crown Victoria, of course, was that extra crown across the roof. It was a two-door sedan hardtop combination in some respects. This car has been accessorized with full wheel covers, fender skirts, rear antenna, and no doubt backup lights, and perhaps some things inside we can't see. One thing that Ford did do in 1956 was emphasize safety features. They were the first to use special door latches. They had a deep dish steering wheel, strongly promoted safety belts, and
Padded
right.
dash.
a padded instrument panel. Yep. So
And there was another variation on the Crown Victoria. That was the Crown
yes.
Victoria with transparent top. So the forward section of the roof would be a piece of plexiglass that would let in light, similar to a sunroof does today. And it would come with its own set of curtains so you could screen out the light. And it was a very seldom seen option within the Crown Victoria. Most folks got the Victoria without the band. So this is an unusual car to see today.
and the Crown Victoria Skyliner was one notch above that. That was the one with the transparent roof. Well,
Now the Park Lane wagon is another unusual Ford for 1956. This is kind of in response to the Chevrolet Nomad that was introduced the year before. It was a real luxury wagon, and the thing about it is it was a two-door wagon. Most folks preferred the four-door wagons just because it's easy to get the family in and out of it. But the Park Lane was a high-style two-door wagon.
it was a response to the Chevrolet Nomad, which had the additional advantage of being a hardtop. But this was clearly an upscale vehicle, and considering what it was, it sold rather well. This particular example has one flourish that was somewhat popular with Ford owners for 56, and that is that you could take Mercury station wagon tail lamps and put them in the Ford openings, because the Mercury wagons used the same quarter panels as the Fords. So the taillights on this thing have the Mercury pattern with the red part at the top and the backup light on the bottom, while a Ford was typically a round red taillight with the backup light in the top. So this somebody has given a special attention to eye-catching features with this car, including the grill guard in the front, the extra wheel trims, the visor, the stone shields and rocker panel moldings. So you don't see too many like this, and Park Lanes were even rare at the time. You must be pointing to the padded instrument panel. Oh,
okay.
okay.
Yeah, that was a traffic light viewer that's mounted on the top of the instrument panel. So you could see the traffic signal when you're close to it because you had that visor obstructing the view normally. So you use it's a prism that you could view the traffic light to know when it turns green. The other thing about the Park Lane, in addition to having Fairlane level trim, is that it had a snap-on cover for the rear cargo area. Again, it's an extra touch, and it was really a luxury wagon for the time.
It sure was. But those of you who know the Chevrolet Nomad realized it was up against some real tough competition. And it sold rather well considering what it had to sell against. But Ford was known as the wagon master at that time, and this is part of the reason. They did, huh? Okay.
So the owner says they
16,000
they sold twice as many as the Nomad. So this indeed was a good move.
Yeah.
1 year only.
1 year only, yep.
Thank you.
Well, we have an Oldsmobile, a 56 Oldsmobile. I presume it's a Super 88, which was the most popular model in the lineup. There was a Deluxe 88, which was slightly less expensive, but also wasn't as nicely trimmed. And of course, there was the 98, which was the top of the line Oldsmobile, which had a longer wheelbase and an extended rear deck and quarter. But this was the bread and butter Olds of 1956. Olds was very, let's say, vigorously into specialized two-toning, and this was the approach they took for 1956. The other thing they did at the time was they cut away the wheel openings to give more of a racy look. You'll notice how the front fender opening does not just encircle the wheel, it's sliced back, and the same theme is reported out back. Roger, anything more to add?
Yes, rocket themes predominate in this style. You'll notice the hood ornament actually has vapor trails impressed into the metal behind it. Also, Oldsmobile continued the rocket taillights. You'll see that the spinner wheel covers, again, was a very popular aftermarket accessory. Sometimes it became a very popular thing to steal from parked cars. But it became real popular with hot rodders, and you saw a lot of these around. They were an option, so you didn't see them on every Oldsmobile, but they sure gave a little bit of flash to the wheels. And Olds kind of became known for them. As we said before, they were sometimes called Fiesta or Starfire spinners. You'll notice the jet-styled intake for the grille. This is an early adaptation or adaptation of a bumper grill combination. So you didn't have a separate bottom bumper with a grill above it. You had the bumper encircling the grill and kind of gave an aircraft style to the front of the Oldsmobile. Oldsmobiles at this time were very high style cars, and Super 88s were really the way to go because you got good performance and good value.
Now there is one point to make about those spinner wheel covers. When the safety what do you want to call it, the safety emphasis was put on cars by the U.S. government, spinner wheel covers were among the first thing to go. The government essentially forbid their use. I don't suppose very many people were injured by them, but the potential was there, and they drew a hard line against them. But they sure were popular for a brief period. And thanks for bringing the vehicle around. Looks like we got 57s coming. Well, 57 Ford Thunderbird. Is this number 220? Oh, 227. Okay.
It's brought in by Christine and Doug Rickman of Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. By 1957, this is the third year that Thunderbird was available in the two-seater configuration, and it turned out to be the last time it was until 2002. 57 had a long model year, so it was worth Ford investing a little bit of extra money to make some major revisions. The most obvious revision is in the rear quarters, where they had canted blades in place of the old type taillight design. So it gave it a more modern look and gave it a more dynamic look. And the biggest part is that extended rear deck gave you more luggage room. So it was the actual practical consideration as well. Thunderbirds were still available with two tops, and actually three, because you had two hardtop designs that were made of fiberglass, one that was solid, one that had porthole windows. The solid top, I believe, was standard. You also had the option of getting the soft convertible top that you could retract behind the rear seats. So Thunderbirds were a very versatile car, and if anything, the 57 even became better.
Yeah, it was really lamented after it went. People wished Ford had kept it alive. Did he mention the color of this car is dusk rose, which is sort of special in itself? They have put side cowl vents in the fenders to improve airflow in the passenger compartment, and the extension, of course, helped improve the trunk, the luggage carrying capacity. In 56, they tried to do it by mounting the spare tire on the rear bumper, which didn't really go over that well. Anyway,
the interesting thing too is about these wheel covers. These are the turbine style wheel covers, which you didn't often see. They were also optional on conventional Fords that year as well.
Okay, thank you for bringing it around.
Thanks very much. I like the matching sunglasses.
Yes.
We know about this guy.
Well, this is a Hemi. Yeah,
Yeah,
57 Dodge, custom Royal Lancer two-door hardtop with a Hemi engine. Of course, the Hemi engine was still in its first go-around when this car was built.
Yes, it's brought in by Larry Miller from Plymouth, Michigan. This is an impressive looking car because you don't see them too often. You can see how Chrysler Corporation cars went to the forward look and took it a little further in 1957. This style was so radical for back then that legend has it that GM engineers, when they saw these cars in the back lots of the factory, they went back and revised their 1959 design so that they could compete with it. These cars were extremely low, and they had these tall tail fins, but the fins were just grafted into the body, and everything looked seamless. They had just the right amount of trim, and those 4-bar Lancer hubcaps were super popular.
They sure were.
These cars look great. And that actually goes for all the Chrysler products that year. So if you thought the 55s are really something, 57s were that much better.
The Hemi engine is 354 cubic inch hemispherical combustion chambers. It has 2 Carter 4-barrel carburetors, and it is rated at 340 gross horsepower. By today's standards, we'd call it gross horsepower. The car weighs 3,885 pounds and was priced at $3,279.
And worth every penny.
Worth every penny. Okay.
Custom Royal was the top line of the Dodge series for 1957. You'll also notice the slanted dual rear antennas. That was also a popular look. And all the Chrysler Corporation cars, except for the Imperial, offered a performance variant. In 1957, Dodge offered the D500 package, which this car has. And that gave you the Hemi engine, which was not a conventional power plant that you'd see in a Dodge. Plymouth offered the Fury as a performance car. And it was all started by the Chrysler 300 in 1955. And Desoto even offered the Adventurer, which was a performance version of the Desoto. So not only was Chrysler competing heavily in looks, but they had the performance to back it up. Thanks very much. It's a very unusual car. Thanks.
What are you getting now? The Studebaker Hawk?
Yep, looks like 57.
Okay. We have a pair of 1957 Studebaker Golden Hawks. The white one is brought to us by Neil and Robin Laughlin of Ortonville, Michigan. And we'll find the ticket here on the gold-colored one.
It's brought in by Brian Butler of Bloomfield Hills, Michigan.
Okay, well, both of them, if they are what they are supposed to be, were powered by a 289 cubic inch V8 engine with a supercharger, a McCullough supercharger, which enabled it the engine to develop 275 horsepower, even with just a 2-barrel carburetor. A supercharger will do wonders for an engine. Transmission choice was overdrive or flight-o-matic, which was Studebaker's 3-speed automatic transmission. Golden Hawks had slightly different styling changes for 57, but the major change was because the original Golden Hawk had been powered with a Packard engine. The attempt was to provide comparable performance with a smaller Studebaker engine that could be made in-house rather than, well, the Packard plant was being closed down anyway, and the key to that accomplishment was the supercharger.
Yeah, the Studebaker Hawk series was kind of an outgrowth of the 1955 President Speedster. So it was their performance variant. You'll notice that the hood has a fiberglass top to it, and that's to clear the supercharger. So you didn't have to make a radical change in the hood to be able to accommodate it. The interesting thing about these two vehicles is you can instantly see the difference in the color combinations if you reverse them. Gold and white and gold and white. And they're very impressive, and it should be noted that gold fits a Golden Hawk. The Hawk was a whole family of vehicles that Studebaker offered. It was their two-door cars. They had a 120-inch wheelbase, which was quite long for a sporty type of a car. They also had Power Hawks and Sky Hawks and Silver Hawks. But the Golden Hawk was the top of the heap, and that was known as the performance model.
They actually took their leftover, their 1953 vintage two-door hardtop, which was the Starlight Coupe, Starliner, and gave it a special personality by putting fins on the rear and that central theme grille, which in the mid-50s was not the way people were doing things in the U.S. So it was an attention getter for sure. And thanks for bringing this pair to us.
Thanks very much.
Well, here's an unusual car. You see lots of Chevrolet two-door hardtops, but nearly all of them are Bel Airs, which was the top of the line. But this is a 210, which is a mid-level. You can't really call it an economy version, but it's the, let's say it's the plain Jane, but it has a certain elegance of its own because it's understated. There's no flashy anodized aluminum on the quarter panels, and but yet it retains all the key features, the tail fin quarter panels and the hardtop styling. Is this one powered with a 265 engine, or is it a 327? 283, yeah. Yeah, whoever put this sheet together didn't get it quite right. Roger, have you got better specs on the engine?
Well, this Series 2100 was brought in by Larry Wilson of Commerce Township, Michigan. Chevrolet was extending their two-door hardtop body style, or Bel Air body style, to the mid-level series during the 1950s. So this gave customers an opportunity to get a hardtop that's sportier looking in a mid-level series. So they could save a little money on this. But as Jim pointed out, you still got some premium trim, and it wasn't bottom of the line by any means. But it's a very unusual sighting today because most people bought Bel Airs if they bought hardtops. So the 210 series is very unusual to see in this body type configuration.
I think there was also a four-door hardtop in the 210, wasn't there?
Yes, there was.
That's what I thought. So, you know, it may not be the jazzy one that a lot of people wanted. It is distinctive because of what it is.
Now, is this write-up correct in saying it's got 44,000 miles? It's a very low mileage car, so it's essentially
well preserved.
A great representation of what it would look like in 1957.
Thank you very much. Well, it's got power glide.
Yes. Next, we have a 1957 Pontiac brought in by Paul Lemieux of Oxford, Michigan. Pontiac shared the same A body style as Chevrolet did in the mid-50s, and this represents a Chieftain. This is, believe it or not, the bottom of the line for Pontiac in 1957. Pontiac fielded 3 series, the Chieftain, the Super Chief, and the Star Chief. And at mid-year, they introduced the Bonneville as a specialty model. They also fielded a full line of station wagons. Pontiac called their two-door hardtop or pillarless design Catalina. So this was a Pontiac Catalina, and if it had 4 doors, it was a 4-door Catalina. So Pontiacs were starting on their rise, and they would achieve 3rd place in sales by the 1960s. But this represented a clear break from previous designs because Pontiac was known for its silver streaks. 57 was the first year they took the silver streaks off of the hood since 1935. So it was a clear departure, and it showed that Pontiac was going in a new direction, and that new direction would eventually be a performance direction. You'll notice the unusual grille. Some folks said that it looked like an electric shaver, but it was a clear departure from previous designs. And the windshield is changed on this model. Pontiac and Chevrolet both put a lot of money in their 1957 revisions, because if you were carrying a 3-year body cycle in the mid-1950s, by the 3rd year, you're kind of getting a little bit behind the times. You saw what the Dodge looked like a few moments ago. Totally different than what this Pontiac looks like. So Pontiac would be new in 1958. Pontiac had a star theme for their cars. Based on their top-line Star Chief series, you'll see that even the Chieftain carries 3 stars on the side. And this is the shorter wheelbase Pontiac as well. So the Star Chief was a little bit longer than this one was. But still a really nice, pleasing-looking vehicle.
It was the first year that Bunky Knudsen was in charge of Pontiac division, and one of the first things he did was took the silver streaks off the Pontiac, which had been there since 1935, and somebody, I guess, criticized them, and he said, well, his father put them on, he could take them off.
Another change for Pontiac in 1957, as well as a lot of other makes, is they went to 14-inch wheels. Prior to that, most cars had 15-inch wheels, and Buick was one of the ones that retained 15-inch wheels even into the 1960s. But it gave the car a lower stance. So there was a lot of attempts at making cars look lower. This is the only year that Pontiac used a 347 cubic inch V8. It would later grow to the popular 389 V8 that was almost used across the board on Pontiac models. So this is the beginning of Pontiac's resurgence. And as I said, by the 1960s, they were number 3 in sales in high flyers.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that General Motors elected to kill it. Of course, they did the same thing with Oldsmobile, but that was more to be expected, I guess. Well, thank you for bringing it around.
And according to my notes, this is a 100,000-mile car.
Oh, really?
Now, Pontiac used to have a slogan in the early 50s that said, built to last 100,000
right.
miles. So I guess it's a pretty good example. He's got 99996 on it, so it's almost 100,000 miles.
Till he gets it home, he'll be there.
Thanks very much for bringing it.
Well, we have a 57 Plymouth.
Next, we have a 57 Plymouth Belvedere, brought in by Leon Hunt of Grass Lake, Michigan. What's unusual about this car is that it's a sports sedan. Very rarely did you see Plymouth 4-door hardtops back in the 1950s. Usually the 4-door hardtop body style was more prevalent on higher priced cars. But this is a very unusual body style to have on a Plymouth. Plymouth was all new in 1957 and reflected the evolution of the forward look. You could see how high the fins were getting in the back. They would even get higher than that in 1959. One thing to note about this Plymouth is the wheel covers, the famous Plymouth cones. This was another popular wheel cover to use by hot rodders in the aftermarket. They were just classic, spun aluminum with the little checkers on the rim. And Plymouth went to 14-inch wheels this year as well, and you can see how much lower the car looks.
It was also Chrysler's switch to torsion bar front suspension and ball joint spindles. So there was a major chassis improvement at the same time. Now, according to the data we've been given, they're saying this is a 6-cylinder, it's given 6-cylinder specs. I see the V's on the front fender, and I can't believe anybody would buy a Belvedere 4-door hardtop with a 6. So, 301 V8. 4-barrel or 2-barrel? So that was, as I recall, what, 215 horsepower? Something like that. Yeah, that's more in keeping with the rest of the car.
You notice that the Plymouth has tinted glass, and Chrysler's promotional name for that is Solex glass. And that was another unusual thing. Usually you didn't see that in the mid-50s as much as you do today. You'll also notice the subtle two-toning. It's not quite as flamboyant. The roof is accented with the center trim. But this is really a nice-looking car, and it's got a trailer to match it, looks like, in the same colors.
Yep. Well, Solex was actually a trademark of PPG, or Pittsburgh Plate Glass, who was Chrysler's supplier. But Chrysler is the one that promoted it, that's for sure.
Now, is this a power flight or a torque flight? Okay, this is a torque flight, which is Chrysler's 3-speed automatic transmission. And Chrysler was a manufacturer. They went to all push-button operation for their automatic transmissions in 1956. So that made a Chrysler car a little bit unique. Thank you.
Looks like he has a model on the rear package shelf, too. It can be seen from the other side of the road. Okay. We got some kind of a 58 Corvette, huh? A quad light Corvette.
Next up, we have a 1958 Corvette brought in by Richard Pinke of Allen Park, Michigan. Rich has been a participant in Motor Muster for many years, and we've talked about his Corvette many times. This is a very authentic example of a 1958 Corvette. In 1958, Chevrolet made several revisions to the Corvette, and one of the things they did was they changed the side sculpturing. And they made those 3 hash marks on the side as part of the design. That became a very effective way to two-tone the Corvette to keep it up with the times. 58 and only 1958 used simulated louvers on the hood. And also, the chrome spears on the deck lid. They were both removed for 1959. So that's one way you can tell a 58 Corvette very easily. Rich's car is Panama yellow and is equipped with a 283 V8. And is this a dual quad? 270 horse.
So that means it has a Duntov camshaft as well. So that was second only to the fuel-injected V8 with a Duntov, which was not that common. So yours was the performance car that people bought in larger numbers, I would suspect.
And you have the 4-speed transmission? 41,000 miles on this car. Rich says it does have the 4-speed. Chevrolet made the 4-speed optional the year before, in 1957. And Corvette also came with a choice of tops. You could either get the soft top that Rich has in place right now, or it also came with a fiberglass hard top, or you could order both. Some aftermarket companies offered a lift that you could install in your garage to help one person lift off that fiberglass hardtop. And he says he's got one in the garage.
Okay.
It's hard for one person to do that. By this time, Corvette has not only become a little more sophisticated, but it also has become a real performance car. They started in 1953 with a 6-cylinder engine and a power glide transmission, and by 1958, you could have all-out performance.
Actually, after 56, there was a clear jump in 56 from what it had been before. The 55s came with V8s, but there weren't that many built. Well, thank you again for bringing this
A
around.
great example of a late 50s Corvette.
Sure is.
Here's a big boy.
Yeah, yeah. 1958 Continental Mark III. Now they have it down as a Lincoln Continental Mark III, but back then Ford didn't use the Lincoln name as its top name. Continental was it, and then they realized what everybody knew, that Lincoln and Continental went together like a hand and glove. But enough of that. This is brought to us by Doug and Christine Richmond of Bloomfield Hills. And according to what they have down here, the base price was $6,012, but in 1958 that was a fair amount of change. The engine is a 430 cubic inch V8, 375 horsepower. Wheelbase is 131 inches, which is about as long as a Lincoln ever got if it wasn't a limousine.
Yes, that's F-150 long wheelbase.
Yeah,
Wheelbase.
yeah, 229 inches overall. Has a turbo drive automatic transmission, which was a Ford-built automatic. And it was had more in common with the plain Lincoln in that era as opposed to the Mark II Continental, which was extremely unique, but not readily built at a price they thought they could sell.
Man, this is a big car. And they had to build an entirely new assembly plant to be able to produce it. This is when the Wixom plant opened in Michigan, and that's when they started to build these Lincolns alongside the Thunderbird, which was also new for 1958. And the thing about the Lincoln is it was the largest unit body car made up to that time. This is not a frame car, this is a unit body car. And in 1958, that was pretty unusual. The convertible model was only available in the Mark III series. And you'll notice that it has a reverse slanting rear window. That's really a convertible. It does look like a hardtop, but that rear window is retractable. And the top retracts underneath that cover that's in back of it. So there's no convertible dust cover or boot as the regular convertible usually has. You'll notice that the famous Continental Star is embroidered into the top material on the side. This is how they came. And this is a real attempt at Lincoln to forever say, Cadillac, you're not the biggest one. And it's really nicely styled for 1958. And they made this car until 1960. Every year the Lincoln Mark became one more. So the 59 was a Mark IV. But this is a very unique car because of the way the top retracts and the way the car is built. I believe this one has coil spring rear suspension.
Yeah,
And this is the only, I think this is the only year they used that, both for Lincoln and Thunderbird, because they reverted back to leaf springs in 1959. So there was a lot of features on this car that were very unique for the time. And
32,000 miles.
an original car, which is really hard to find. And it's a top line car. That's what's really neat
Yeah,
about it.
that's even more so. Well, it's one you don't take out in bad weather.
Thank you very much for bringing it.
Yes. Whoever put these sheets together sure didn't get them right. Well, we have a pair of 59 Cadillacs rolling up. And we'll-
The blue car was brought in by Carl Wallagora of Allen Park, Michigan. And the coupe was brought in by Dirk van Musenberg of Farmington, Michigan. So, 1959 Cadillac. This was the first year of the complete revised line of GM cars. You can see that Cadillacs probably were about the same length as the Lincoln that just paraded. But the thing that differentiated this year was the fins. This is what everybody likes about 59 Cadillacs is the fins. Not only did they have tall rear tail fins that were creeping up every year throughout the 1950s. This is as tall as they got. And fittingly, it ended the decade. But the thing about the 59 Cadillac is also incorporated the twin bullet taillights within the fin design. So you had a double-barreled styling feature here. This reflected the new GM styling overall. And you'll notice that the two-door Sport Coupe, which is that a Coupe de Ville? Okay, Series 62. The Coupe de Ville had a more luxury trimmed interior, but believe it or not, the yellow car is a base level Cadillac. I mean, it looks great.
You don't get any cheaper than that.
And look how nice it looks.
Yes, it is.
And the four-door model, it's a Cadillac called that a four-window design. They also had a six-window design with a different type of roof line, but what made this one different is that it had a small visor over the rear glass that completely wrapped around.
Yes.
And look at the huge windshields on these cars. So the styling and the technology to develop glass to this extent was really impressive in the late 1950s.
Well, as our late friend and fellow auto historian Jeffrey Godshaw once remarked at one of these motor musters, this was when fins were high and America ruled the industrial world. And that sort of says it all for these cars. Thank you all.
Thanks very much.
See, that four-window sedan is usually the capstone, but things, well.
Next up, we have a longtime Motor Muster participant since the 1980s. 59 Buick Electra 225 convertible, brought in by Nick and Teresa Chapekis of Ypsilanti, Michigan. They've been longtime Motor Muster participants, but the difference this year is that they had the interior redone as well as a complete paint job on the car. So it looks just as fresh as it can look. Buick also was new for 1959. You can see that they have an unusual styling theme for the front where they had the headlights slanted to match the fender lines. So this became a very unusual appearance. And it went into its own unique brand of fins in the back. They were canted and they had bullet-type taillights to cap the rear end ensemble. So this was the top-line convertible that Buick fielded for 1959. Nick has the regular interior in here, but there was also Buick offered bucket seats that year too. But he's got the more conventional bench seats that you used to see more often. Buick convertibles in the Electra 225 series. They also featured power windows as standard, and it was a really luxury car. Nick's family has owned this car since new. So that's a lot of years where you could have traded it on something else but didn't. So that's a long time to keep a car.
It's been worth every minute of it. For the attention that this car must get every year, it's probably incredible.
But Jim, tell us about the 225 part.
Well, of course, that was the intended to be the overall length, but this car actually is not that long because it was not built. The 225 name applied to the four doors. The actual measurement applied only to the four doors, and these were slightly shorter, like what, 220 or something like that. Not quite 225, but that was the name that replaced Limited or Roadmaster in the Buick hierarchy. We certainly do enjoy this car each year, and I think many of the show attenders have also.
And we talk about trim details, and notice on this Buick how they hid the outside door locks within the trim on the side. You kind of can't tell they're there. So they did a lot of this in the 1950s. The ornamentation was never better. Thanks very much. It's always good to see this car.
Yep. We have a pair of 59 Ford Thunderbirds. Yeah, I guess that's it. Okay, two of them.
Okay, the convertible is brought in by David Lau of Plymouth, Michigan. And the hardtop is brought in by George Roscoe of New Boston, Michigan. Thunderbirds were all new in 1958. And like the Lincoln Continental that you saw parade before, they were built at a brand new Wixom plant. So there's a lot of differences in these Thunderbirds compared to the previous model. For one thing, they went from the two-seater to the four-seater configuration. People really were against that. The general public that actually ended up probably buying Fairlanes said that you can't have a Thunderbird if it's not a two-seater. But when they came out with the four-seater design, their sales went 4 times as much. So they had the right idea. And what this is represents the dawn of the personal luxury car as we know it today. 4 places, compact, very elegant styling. They had a lot of cues that they adopted from the regular Ford line. The canted blades in the back, the hooded headlights in the front. But Thunderbird was its own car. The other part about the Thunderbird that made it really different is that it was a unitized design. Again, Wixom was built to accommodate unit design cars. So this car doesn't have a frame. However, in 1959, they changed over from a coil spring rear suspension to a more conventional leaf spring suspension. And when I sat in these cars when I was in grade school, I was just blown away by the twin cove instrument panel and the bucket seats. Bucket seats were standard on Thunderbirds. That was like incredulous at the time. And they were not only comfortable, but they looked great. The rear seat was styled to be bucket-like, so it had the impressions of being a bucket seat as well. Now, the convertible had a very unique top retracting mechanism that they kind of adopted from the Ford Skyliner retractable hardtop. It was a soft top design, but the trunk would lift up and the top would retract into it. So it was completely automatic and eliminated the need for the dust boot. Very sleek lines resulted. You'll notice that the depressed deck lid is kind of carried through to the interior. You'll notice that the wraparound windshield doesn't have a molding at the base. This made it look like that interior flowed right through. You'll also notice the power dome on the hood kind of gave it a sporty performance flavor. The 1959 had a few trim revisions over the 58, but it was essentially a carryover car. But it was a little bit cleaned up. It was a popular design compared to the original two-seater Thunderbird and a very luxurious interpretation.
Well, there's not much more I can say to top that, but these cars were really a sensation when they hit, when you figure that it was a rather limited market. The market for personal luxury coupes and convertibles is never going to be that big. So when you think about that context, these were real winners. And we certainly appreciate seeing them every year, and I believe our guests do too.
Yes, another unique thing about these Thunderbirds were that they also incorporated a console between the bucket seats. At that time, the console contained a radio speaker, and if you ordered them, they also contained the optional power window controls. So that was another unique styling feature. So the Thunderbirds are really different. The convertible has what we generally call a Continental kit, which was an option, but I think Ford referred to it as a sports spare wheel carrier. So everything had a promotional name back in the 1950s. Now, these are standard wheel covers for the Thunderbird, except they have the optional tricolored centers. So there's details here that you could probably look all afternoon at and pick off. But they're really nicely designed cars. Thanks very much for bringing them.
I think we are seeing the finale of today's presentation in the form of a 1959 Studebaker Lark brought here by Dale and Cheryl Konya. Is that about right?
Konya.
Okay.
From Prudenville, Michigan.
And it's a 6-cylinder, which means it was bought to save gasoline and still be sporty looking, I guess. Has an L-head engine, 170 cubic inches roughly, 90 horsepower, a 1-barrel carburetor. After all this high performance stuff, this is sort of a letdown maybe, but hey, these cars helped keep the Studebaker car brand alive for a number of years. They were a yeah, you'd have to say they were successful in the marketplace. The Lark was introduced early in '59, and it was produced by what was then Studebaker Packard. This car was from Nevada, has original paint, and the only maintenance has been replacement due to the desert environment drying out the rubber parts, which I guess if you live in a desert area, you know this happens.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the Studebaker Lark is, as Jim mentioned, Studebaker was kind of in trouble by the late 1950s. So what they did is they took their basic 1953 central body and they lopped off each end of it. And they decided to compete in the compact car field rather than the full-size car field, which they're not doing too well at. They were successful basically based on timing, because in 1959, Rambler became very popular because it was a compact car, and after the 1958 recession, that's kind of what people were looking for. So they were slightly ahead of the game because the Big Three introduced their compacts in 1960. The other thing about Studebaker Larks is that it was a whole family of body types. They had wagons, they had sedans, they had hardtops. But the other thing is they added a convertible for 1960. So they had a whole family of compact cars slightly ahead of what the other manufacturers were offered. And they did it on a budget because they basically used the 53 engineering to develop a car for the 1960s. Larks were pretty popular in 1959 and 60, and they soldiered on through part of the 60s until Studebaker unfortunately went out of business. But these are really nice looking cars, and they're very perky looking. And the hardtop represents the top of the line offered in 1959. Thank you.
And it appears as if this concludes our presentation for this year. Come back again. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, and it's good to be back.